Emily gets kicked out in a New York minute. If I close my eyes, I can still remember that bittersweet October evening, the kind where New York's wind nips your face just enough to make your eyes water. Maybe that's why mine were already glossy before it all went down. I was 18, fresh out of high school, convinced the world waited for me right outside our brownstone in Astoria. Turns out it was waiting, but not the way I'd ever imagined. Let's rewind a bit. My adoptive parents, Brian and Margaret Thompson, weren't perfect, but they'd always tried their best. Or at least, that's what I believed until that night. One rumor, a careless set of texts, misunderstood and blown sky high, sparked an argument so fierce the neighbors probably heard every word. Minutes later, my world cracked. Margaret's voice, usually warm with Midwestern honey, trembled as she told me I had to leave. Brian stood in the kitchen, jaw clenched, unable to meet my gaze. No matter how much I pleaded, insisting it was a mistake, their minds were set. There's a kind of heartbreak not even New York traffic can drown out. So, what do you do when you're suddenly homeless in a city that barely notices you exist? I packed my life, well, whatever could fit, in a backpack. My journal, $48 in crumpled bills, some Polaroids, and way too much anxiety. That front door slammed behind me, echoing down the hallway like a judge's gavel. Suddenly, the streetlights felt colder, the subway louder, and my future stretched out before me. Messy, uncertain, and entirely my own for the first time ever. Emily's early struggles on her own. When the door closed behind me for the last time, Manhattan didn't greet me like a movie set. There were no flashing lights or serendipitous run-ins. My first nights blurred together in a haze of uncertainty, wandering downtown blocks that buzzed with urgency, searching for a place that wouldn't immediately shoo me away. My savings, if you could call them that, consisted of a crumpled 50, 3/4, and a half-used subway card. The first job I landed was at a greasy spoon diner that didn't care where you came from, as long as you showed up on time. My hands shook the first day. Part nerves, part hunger. I cleared tables, poured endless cups of coffee for Wall Street regulars, and pretended I didn't notice tips that were scattered like confetti. Sleep was a luxury. Some nights, I crashed on a friend's couch. Other nights, in the overlit waiting rooms of 24-hour laundromats. Showering meant sneaking into the gym late, hoping no one would ask about my non-existent membership. But I kept going, somehow. I kept journals filled with dreams and maps of possibilities, little shops I might someday run, neighborhoods I might be able to afford. There were moments when I wanted to give up, when my shoes were soaked after a shift, or when a busker's song under the neon lights made my chest ache for stability. At times, I wondered why I was out here at all, clinging to survival by my fingernails, in a city that barely noticed my existence. Still, something burned inside, a stubborn hope that one day I'd look back and know it was all worth it. Those gritty early years taught me more than any classroom ever had. I learned to read people, to trust myself, and to stand my ground, even when the city wanted to swallow me whole. Every cup I poured, every midnight walk, became a small victory. And though I stumbled more times than I could count, I never stayed down for long. The city had tried to break me, but it was unknowingly teaching me how to make it my own. Fate steps in at a Brooklyn bakery. There are moments in life that shimmer, where all the chaos quiets, and something, or someone, pulls you into a new orbit. For me, that moment came one late November night at the corner of Flatbush and Bergen in Brooklyn. By then, I'd survived nearly a year on my own. I was toughened by city winters, hungry for both belonging and a halfway decent meal. and still carrying the bruises of being tossed aside by the only family I'd known. I'd picked up a part-time gig at a tiny bakery, Sunrise Sweets, run by a woman named Maggie O'Hara. The place was perpetually smelling of cinnamon and strong coffee. I wasn't really supposed to be working that shift. I'd filled in last minute after another worker called out. Looking back, that twist of fate saved me in more ways than I could count. Maggie was in her late 50s, Irish-American, wiry with quicksilver eyes, and a surprisingly loud laugh that bounced off the flour-dusted counters. She read people in seconds, it seemed, and didn't tolerate much nonsense. On my first shift, I bungled an order and dropped a rack of croissants. I expected to be fired on the spot. Instead, she looked at the mess, then at my shaking hands, and said simply, "Everyone gets nervous their first time. Now grab a broom." It was the first mercy I'd felt in months. In the coming weeks, I worked long hours, sometimes baking before sunrise, sometimes sweeping up after midnight closings. The kitchen became my new classroom. Maggie taught by doing, not by talking. She showed me how to swirl a cinnamon roll so the sugar caramelized just right, how to knead dough until my wrists ached, how to listen for the sound of a loaf that's baked to a golden song, as she called it. It wasn't just the recipes she shared. During slow afternoons, she'd pour us both cups of that jet black coffee and ask about my life. There was no pity, just curiosity. She'd tell stories, too, of coming to New York in the 70s, raising twins with a taxi driver husband, nearly losing the shop during the financial crisis, rebuilding everything from nothing. Her resilience sparkled through every sentence. For the first time, under that humming fluorescent light, I saw the outline of a survivor who had made out of hardship something sweet and sustaining. Maggie pushed me hard, sometimes to the point of tears. One night, after I'd pulled my third double shift in a row, she pulled me aside. "Emily, you're running on empty. If you don't find a reason besides money to get up at 4 a.m, this city will eat you alive." Her words hit me in a place I didn't know was still raw. We sat in companionable silence for a while. Then she handed me a notebook. "Write your dreams down," she said. "As many as you can. Big, messy, impossible ones." That became our ritual. Every week, I'd scribble in the notebook. Sometimes grand plans. Open my own bakery, make my mom proud, travel to Paris. Sometimes just simple hopes. Sleep in, eat pancakes for dinner, laugh for no reason. Maggie would read them with a straight face, nodding, never mocking. She became the safe place I'd lost. The more I wrote, the more I remembered I had a future beyond the next rent payment or shift. If family is who steps in when the world closes the door, then Maggie became my accidental kin. She defended me when vendors looked down their noses, handed me a raise before the holidays, and let me raid the leftover pastries for dinner on days I'd barely eaten. The bakery turned into a kind of sanctuary, not just for me, but for a little ecosystem of Brooklyn misfits, burned-out grad students, single parents on their third job, insomniac jazz musicians, all of us circling Maggie's warm orbit. There was one evening that stands out, the night of the first snowfall. The bakery was empty, the glow of streetlights slipping through frosted glass. Maggie pulled out an old Polaroid and snapped a picture. Me, flour on my cheek, grinning and tired. She tacked the photo next to hundreds of others, each a story, each a stray who'd found shelter. "You're family here now, Em," she said quietly. "Whether you like it or not." That was the first time in the city I felt truly seen, not just tolerated or helped, but believed in. Maggie's faith stitched my scattered pieces together, gently, insistently. And from that night forward, I knew my story wasn't just a tale of survival anymore. It was one of becoming, with Brooklyn, with Maggie, and with the smell of rising bread as my witnesses. First taste of success in breaking through. If you asked me when everything started to turn, I'd point to that sticky spring in Brooklyn, a season when, despite the city's cold reputation, the sunlight finally began to linger on the stoops and the scent of rising dough hung in the air. I'd been at Sunrise Sweets for nearly 2 years, my apron no longer pristine, but my confidence stronger with every shift. The bakery wasn't just where I worked, it was where I learned what it meant to build something lasting from almost nothing. Maggie saw in me the spark to do more than clock in and out. One dreary Tuesday, she tossed a faded flyer onto the prep table. Greater New York Amateur Pastry Challenge, calling all bakers under 25. Her smile was sly. Don't tell me you're scared of a little competition, Em. I'd never considered entering a baking contest, let alone one citywide. My hands still shook sometimes when rolling pastry, and my self-doubt could swell like overproofed dough. Still, Maggie insisted, you've got a comeback spirit, girl. Show this city what you're made of. The weeks leading up to the competition were blur and agony. After my shifts, I'd stay late, experimenting with recipes far beyond my comfort zone. Lavender lemon tarts, Earl Grey pound cake. Maggie challenged my every instinct, correcting my whisk game, daring me to take risks. I failed plenty. Burned sugar, flat sponges, a pear galette that split open like a bad secret. But every mistake became a lesson in tenacity. When the day came, I woke before dawn, nerves twisting my stomach tighter than a braided challah. The contest kitchen gleamed, an intimidating lineup of ambitious young bakers in pressed whites, families cheering in the stands. I was the only one alone, just a skinny 20-year-old in thrift store shoes, sleeves rolled too high, heart pounding. For my entry, I baked the same hazelnut chocolate croissants that Maggie swore could cheer up anyone, adding a twist, a sprinkle of smoked salt from a Brooklyn spice shop, and orange zest from the local bodega. When the judges walked by, clipboard in hand, I remembered Maggie's advice. Bake like your whole future's in the oven. After a blur of flour and frantic oven checks, the winners were called. When my name echoed through the auditorium, the surprise nearly knocked me off my feet. I'd taken second place against kids who'd been trained by family pastry dynasties. More important than the certificate or the small scholarship was the sense that I'd proven I could go toe-to-toe with anyone. That victory was just the beginning. Local food bloggers stopped by Sunrise Sweets, ordering the miracle croissant. Soon, Maggie had to hire another worker to keep up with the morning rush. She sent me to workshops, French techniques in Soho, vegan pastry on the Upper West. At each turn, she challenged me to reach further. When she handed over the keys one weekend and let me run closing by myself, my heart nearly burst with pride. It wasn't just career wins. Slowly, I built a small circle of support. Other entry-level bakers, old friends who forgave my drifting, new faces who respected my grit. Living in New York was never easy. Rent still sucked up most of my paycheck. My past still loomed in quiet moments. But each little win cemented my sense of belonging. I learned to save, to invest in my ideas, to ask for advice without apology. The real turning point came a year after that first contest. A tiny storefront on the Lower East Side went up for lease. Former bodega, scuffed floorboards, but perfect windows for letting in golden morning light. It took every penny I'd scraped together, plus a loan co-signed by Maggie, her faith never wavering. But finally, I hung up the shingle. M's Sweet Start, my bakery, My story. The opening day was chaos. Old regulars, new customers, the city's energy pulsing through every inch. I baked through the night, hands blistered and tired, but alive in a way I'd never been before. Some nights after closing, I'd pull out my old journal, the one that survived 10 apartments and too many rainy walks, and smile at my earlier dreams. Maybe I'll run my own place, I'd scribbled. That wild hope was now reality. From loss grew strength. From heartbreak, a fierce new belonging. The city that tried to swallow me had, unknowingly, made me unstoppable. And every morning, with the sunrise glinting on the glass and the smell of caramel in the air, I reminded myself, and anyone who crossed my threshold, that survival is just the beginning. The real triumph comes when you rise. The family's collapse. By the time my own shop, M's Sweet Start, was celebrating its 1-year anniversary, everything felt like the future I'd clawed toward was finally here. I had my crew, young, scrappy bakers and baristas, who reminded me a little of myself. Our regulars lined up before sunrise, for coffee and warmth. That's when the call came. I was sweeping the front steps, phone tucked to my ear as I listened to Lillian's stammering voice. Waited with something more desperate than I'd ever heard before. She spoke fast, breathless, words tumbling over one another, like dominoes tipped with anxiety. Brian was sick, really sick, not just worn down, as she'd always said. The doctors had found cancer, stage 3 at least, but money was gone before the diagnosis was finished. Savings drained. Insurance not enough. Medical bills mounting as quickly as the sense of dread sharpening in her words. It was like an old injury splitting open. I listened, stiff and silent, to my former mother, her voice now brittle with grief and regret. She hesitated, stumbled over apologies and memories. I know I have no right to ask, but we need help. We have no one else, Emily. I looked around at my tiny kingdom. The bakery that had pulled me from the brink. The irony left a bitter taste in my mouth. These were the same people who'd thrown me out onto merciless streets, who shut the door on me in my most desperate moment. Now their world was burning, and they were reaching for the daughter they'd exiled. This time, because need had burned through their pride. My bakery's walls seemed thinner, the city louder. Emotions sparred in my chest. Old hurt, a flicker of pity, even traces of the lost love I'd once begged for from them. That night, I sat at the bakery window for hours, watching headlights flicker past and steam curl through the glass. I shuffled through memory after memory, holidays where I was invisible, birthday candles in empty rooms, that final night's echoing silence. I wondered how much you could ever truly forgive. Is survival enough, or do we all stay chained to the first people who ever let us down? Next days went by in a fog. My phone buzzed with numbers I didn't recognize. Old neighbors, relatives who'd sided with my parents. They're desperate, Emmy. Please. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was elsewhere. I could have ignored them, let karma do its work. That thought soothed and hurt in equal measure. Did I want to see them suffer? Was that who I'd become? But this wasn't just about revenge or pride. I asked myself, over and over, if I was still the girl they'd abandoned. Was my new strength enough to extend a lifeline? In the privacy of my bakery's little office, I unearthed old notes I'd written when I first started out. Scraps about wanting to break cycles, to live differently, to become more than the wounds I carried. That memory burned strongest. Brooklyn may have taught me tough lessons, but it also raised me on a street-level hope that kindness, even to the undeserving, could heal something deep. A week after the call, I met Lillian at a coffee shop near the old neighborhood. Our conversation was awkward, brittle at first, filled with heavy silences and uncertain glances. She looked older, smaller somehow. There were apologies, some whispered, some choked out. There were tears I tried not to show. For her sake and mine, we talked about Brian, about the home falling apart, hopeless bills, sleepless nights. Lillian's hands trembled when I reached over. The first time we'd touched in years. She looked at me with a mother's longing, but also guilt. "We failed you," she admitted softly, almost a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Emily." I breathed in slow, fighting my own tears. I needed you then. But now, I'm stronger than you ever imagined. But I won't let you drown either. Maybe that's what real adulthood feels like. Choosing mercy, even when you could walk away. I arranged for some payments to their hospital, found a social worker who specialized in medical emergencies, and set firm boundaries. I'd help, but I couldn't erase the past. I visited Brian in the sterile hospital room, his eyes filled with silent gratitude and regret. We didn't say much, but he cried when I hugged him goodbye. Those weeks were brutal, a test of everything Brooklyn had taught me. The weight of responsibility wasn't just money or time, but memory and pain, too. Yet in giving what I could, and only what I could, I learned something else. You can be both the survivor and the savior, and neither role has to erase who you once were. Sometimes, the next right thing is the hardest thing. Standing tall, with all my scars showing, I did what needed to be done. Not for them anymore, but for the girl I'd once been. That was my real victory. Returning home with icy resolve. By the time word reached me that Brian wasn't expected to make it through the month, and that the family house in Astoria would likely be sold off to cover debts, I had already weathered every conceivable storm. Magazines had run features on my bakery, my staff was solid, and the old wounds my family left behind had stitched over into something tough and unyielding. But when the texts and voicemails started pouring in, from Aunt Janet, who barely spoke to me growing up, to Lillian, my former mother, begging for a visit, I couldn't ignore the gravity of what was happening. I knew, deep down, it was time to confront the ghosts head on. That decision, to return not as the girl they broke, but as the woman their actions had forced me to become, didn't come easily. For weeks, I rehearsed every possible conversation. What could I say to people who'd thrown me out? Then came crawling back only when circumstance demanded a scapegoat, a savior, a familiar name on a check. But the truth was, I was entering that house not for their sake, but my own. There was unfinished business. There were old rooms that still held fragments of who I'd been, and I wanted to walk those floors one more time with clear eyes and a steady heart. On the day I returned, the sky was a solid gray, typical New York, refusing to decide if it was angry or simply depressed. The blocks around the house looked much the same, though every stoop, every parked car seemed to carry the memory of who I once was. I wore my most unyielding expression, not for drama, but as armor. My hair was tied back tight, my coat buttoned, my movements measured. I had no plan for reconciliation. I was there for closure. I stood before the familiar door, hand paused mid-knock. For a split second, I was 18 again, lost, gasping through tears, suitcase heavy at my side. The memory sharpened, then faded, replaced by the reality of who I'd become. This time, I was entering on my own terms. Lillian answered, her eyes wide as if she'd seen a ghost. She shrank into the doorway, voice a hoarse echo of the woman I remembered. "Emily." I stepped past her, scanning the worn hallway, the crooked photo frames, the shoes still lined by the radiator. Every corner contained echoes of my childhood. Board games played on rainy days. The creek in Stair 3. The bright trail of sunlight that used to slip in each morning. But now, the air felt colder, thinner, haunted by all the words we never said. Brian was in the living room, shrunken within a nest of blankets, a stranger's skin draped over the man who once thundered through the house with disapproval and pride in equal measure. He looked up, confusion turning to awareness in slow, painful increments. I didn't rush to his side. Instead, I sat opposite him, crossing my legs, arms folded, not closed off, but not inviting either. "What do you want from me?" I asked quietly, but without rancor. The question hung in the air, brittle as glass. Lillian hovered in the doorway, torn between relief and humiliation. It was Brian who answered, his voice gravelly, almost childlike. "We didn't know how to do right by you. We thought we could just keep moving forward. But life doesn't just move forward." "Are you sorry?" I asked. "Or just sorry you need me now?" He winced. There was a long silence. Lillian's hands found the doorframe, as if steadying herself against the weight of years. "We've made mistakes, Emily. I know I can't erase them. If you never forgive us, I'll understand. But you're still family, even if we failed you when you needed us most." A flood of memories threatened to break me. The first time I aced a test, and Brian barely grunted acknowledgement. Margaret's attempts, clumsy but real, to rebalance family dinners after the big fight. The endless, gnawing hunger for affection. I kept my composure. I owed them nothing, and especially not tears. "I came because I needed to," I said after a moment. "Not for you, for me." My voice surprised me. Firm, steady, and a little foreign. Brian nodded, trying to absorb the shift in power. "You've built a life without us, more than we did for you." There was a softness in Lillian's eyes. Hope, shame, maybe relief. She offered tea, as if that might bridge the chasm between us. But I declined. Instead, I walked the house, room by room, cataloging losses and letting go. The dent in my old bedroom door, the sag in the hallway, where I used to sit with music in my ears, wishing for anything except these four walls. This wasn't a home anymore, just a structure cluttered with the remnants of another life. We danced around apologies, never quite naming things. That was fine with me. I didn't need to hear regret uttered 100 different ways. I'd rewritten my narrative elsewhere, in my own handwriting, on my own terms. But still, the talk pressed on. The finances were dire, the hospital bills devastating. They didn't outright beg, but the expectation hovered, silent and desperate. I told them what I could do, nothing more, nothing less. I agreed to pay what I could for the medical bills, to contact attorneys, social workers, whatever was needed to keep Brian comfortable. But I was clear. I wasn't the kid seeking their approval anymore. I was only the woman deciding, with cold reason, what my boundaries would be. That night, after an awkward dinner, Lillian fussing with plates, Brian dozing mid-conversation, I stood in the empty kitchen, staring at the window above the sink. I remembered the girl who'd used to wash dishes here, watching city lights blink on across the river, trying to predict the shape of her own future. Returning as a stranger to that tender hope hurt and healed me in equal measure. Before leaving, I found a box with childhood photos. Me as a gap-toothed second grader in Halloween makeup. Me scowling through a middle school science fair. I sorted through them silently and took only one, sliding it into my pocket. As I passed the living room, Brian stirred. His eyes met mine. Not full of answers, just a fragile gratitude that I'd shown up at all. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice small, unsure. "For me," I said, barely more than a whisper. When I closed the front door, the cold October air bit my face, but I barely felt it. My old life was behind me. For the first time, I looked at that house, not with longing or rage, but with a chilly detachment. I'd survived what should have broken me. Their home was no longer my anchor. If anything, it was a buoy, marking a place I'd already left behind. Back in Brooklyn, I slipped into my own bakery after hours, savoring the scent of flour and chocolate and all the warm things I'd built for myself. My friends, my real family, waited at a table, ready to hear whatever I wanted to share. Maybe, eventually, forgiveness would find me, cool and clear as the river at dawn. But for now, I understood fully. My worth had never depended on their acceptance. I had returned home, but it was only so I could finally, truly, leave, choosing forgiveness and the power of self-mastery. Forgiveness is a messy, complicated thing, and for me, it never arrived with fanfare or dramatic, teary-eyed reconciliations. In fact, my journey toward forgiving my adoptive parents was neither swift nor linear. It was a process defined by internal wrestling, late-night journal entries, and quiet moments spent alone in my Brooklyn apartment, weighing the cost and the liberation that forgiveness could bring. By the time Brian's health was failing, and Lillian reached out in desperation, I was standing at a crossroads, swaddled in hard-earned independence. To forgive or not, that single choice would, in many ways, determine the kind of adult I'd become. That winter, the city outside my bakery window seemed locked in ice and silence. My hands found comfort in routine, braiding loaves, dusting each pastry with sugar, tallying up receipts at day's end. But my heart was restless. Every phone call from Lillian pressed a fresh ache into old scars, those wounds I'd protected so fiercely through years on my own. Some nights, I tossed in bed, asking myself if I owed them anything beyond what I'd already given. Compassion, help, money, visits to hospital corridors filled with clattering carts and antiseptic smells. Was forgiveness about letting them off the hook? Or was it about freeing myself? The idea that I could become the author of my own freedom was seductive. I'd learned in Brooklyn that true power isn't loud, it's steady. It's found in small, daily kindnesses to myself and others. So, while I made arrangements for Brian's care and negotiated payment plans for their mounting debts, I respected my own boundaries with a tenderness no one else ever had. I saw to their needs, but I didn't lose myself to guilt or nostalgia. I told Lillian plainly that our past couldn't be swept aside with a single apology or desperate plea. Any relationship from here would have to be built on honesty, respect, and acceptance of the pain that still reverberated between us. Forgiveness did not erase the memory of being put out on those cold Astoria streets, nor did it cancel the lonely nights, or the feeling that I'd been unworthy of love unless I met someone else's standards of perfection. But as weeks spun by, as Brian's illness took its toll, making him smaller, quieter, less like the angry man of my childhood, I saw something else reflected in the daily business of caring for others. I saw my own resilience, my ability to help, not because I was weak or desperate for approval, but because my strength was finally mine to give. One Sunday afternoon, I sat across from Lillian at the kitchen table in their now cluttered home. Her hands twisted a napkin into knots, eyes rimmed red from worry and sleeplessness. For a long time, neither of us spoke. It was an awkward silence, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. At last, she glanced up. "You didn't have to come back, Em. Not after everything we did." I nodded. "I know. I I was afraid you'd never forgive us, she whispered. I haven't. Not completely. I might never. But I'm not carrying it around my neck like a stone anymore either. I'm tired of being angry. I want to live my life for me. Lillian covered her face, shoulders shaking. I wish we'd known how to do better by you. I wish we'd been braver. I needed a family, but I needed myself more. That's what I learned. Those words were true. After all the struggle and yearning, what I found at the end of my journey was the girl who'd survived that night on the sidewalk, grown into a woman who chose herself, in forgiving my parents, not with grand pronouncements, but with small, consistent acts of decency and distance. I became whole in a way I hadn't imagined possible. There were setbacks, naturally. Some days, triggered by a voice or a smell, anger or sorrow would well up unexpectedly. I accepted those feelings, let them wash over me, and then kept moving forward. Just as I jogged through stormy Brooklyn mornings, lungs burning in the cold, strength building with each stride, my real healing came not in pretending the past was different, but in refusing to let it dictate my future. Forgiveness required something many people overlook: self-mastery. I had to train my mind to release bitterness, not for anyone else's comfort, but because I wanted to reclaim my agency. I began meditating, taking long walks by the river, and meeting with a therapist, not to erase the grief, but to make sense of it. Every time I chose to respond with patience, every time I sent a check home, but declined to be drawn into the home's old chaos, I was strengthening new muscles of independence. My boundaries became scaffolding for a new life, sturdy and self-made. The day Brian passed away, I was there, not as a lost daughter, but as a woman who had made peace with herself. I held Lillian's hand. We cried, quietly, our grief shared, but never entirely synchronized. Returning to Brooklyn, I organized a small memorial for the father who'd let me down, inviting my found family from the bakery. We ate pain au chocolat, told gentle stories, and raised a toast, not to the man we wished he'd been, but to the people we'd become despite everything. In time, what amazed me most wasn't the dramatic reunion, or even the slow rebuilding of ties with my adoptive mother. It was the subtle, persistent force of self-trust that bloomed in the aftermath. I looked at myself differently, proud. For so many years, I doubted if I was lovable, if I'd ever belong. But in forgiving, not forgetting, I took back the pen and wrote my own ending. Brooklyn remained my sanctuary, its streets humming with the energy of new beginnings. The bakery continued to thrive, rippling with laughter, flour dust, and the sense of hope. Young women, runaways, dreamers, survivors, came through my doors, and I welcomed them with true empathy. I listened, offered a table and fresh bread, and when they were ready, told them, your story doesn't end with what was done to you. It begins when you decide who you'll become. Years later, when Lillian finally moved into a smaller apartment and the family home faded from our lives, I helped her pack. We discovered boxes of old photos, school medals, even thank you notes I'd written as a child. She pressed one into my hand, tears brimming. You saved me too, Emily. I wish I could have done the same. You did the best you could, I said. I knew that was true now. It was enough. That's the thing about forgiveness. It doesn't change the past. It just releases its hold on your future. In standing tall after the storm, in claiming my right to joy, I unlocked a kind of wealth that can't be measured in dollars or apologies. And in that, I found my greatest reward. Not their love, not even their repentance, but my own unbreakable self-mastery in the freedom to move forward, light, fierce, and finally, truly whole.